I'm leaving, Cho Jung. I have a date at 8. Those 8 words were a glitch in the perfect, high-tech matrix of the Han Corporation. For the first time in 18 months, the cold billionaire CEO, a man whose mafia bloodline taught him that control is the only law, completely lost his composure. This wasn't just a scheduling conflict. It was a lethal blow to his ego. The woman he had relegated to the background, the one he dismissed as just an assistant, had just signaled a massive power shift by revealing a life and a romantic interest that didn't revolve around him. Please like and subscribe. It supports the channel. The 38th floor of the Jung Corporation was a temple of glass and steel, overlooking a skyline that glittered like scattered diamonds against the velvet night. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of Cho Jung's expensive, woodsy cologne and the heavy silence of a strictly professional boundary that was about to shatter. Tasha moved with a predatory elegance of her own, clearing her mahogany desk with the same efficiency she used to manage Cho Jung's billion-dollar organized chaos for the past year and a half. She had spent hours anticipating his every need, translating his curt commands into a global empire, and burying her own feelings under a mask of flawless professionalism. But tonight, the mask was off. Stepping out from behind her desk, Tasha revealed a stunning, form-fitting emerald green dress that signaled her transformation from invisible assistant to a woman with somewhere important to be. As she reached up to adjust a diamond earring, her reflection in the darkened window caught the man watching her from his glass office. Cho Jung, standing with his tie loosened and hands gripped white-knuckle tight against his desk. The digital clock on the wall hummed, the red numbers bleeding into 7:59 p.m. As Tasha turned toward the door, Cho Jung's voice, usually as precise as a blade through silk, cut through the quiet office with a raw, jagged edge that finally exposed the ghost in the machine. The burning jealousy of a mafia boss who realized he was 1 minute away from losing his most valuable asset to another man. The digital clock on the mahogany desk hummed, the red numbers bleeding into a sharp, unforgiving 7:59 p.m. Inside the 38th floor sanctuary of the Han Corporation, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the heavy silence of a strictly professional boundary that was about to shatter. Tasha moved with a predatory elegance, clearing her desk with the same clinical efficiency she had used to manage Cho Jung's billion-dollar organized chaos for the past 18 months. She had spent over a year anticipating his every need, translating his curt, mafia-edged commands into a global empire, and burying her own desires under a mask of flawless professionalism. But tonight, the mask was off. As Tasha stood, she shed her professional armor, revealing a stunning, form-fitting emerald green dress that signaled her transformation from invisible assistant to a woman with a life of her own. She reached up to adjust a diamond earring, her reflection in the darkened window catching the man watching her from his glass office. Cho Jung stood there, his tie loosened, a rare, jagged sign of disorder, and his hands gripped white-knuckle tight against his desk. He looked like a predator sensing his territory was about to be invaded, his dark eyes boring into her with a heat that was no longer strictly business. I'm leaving, Cho Jung. I have a date at 8. The words fell from Tasha's lips with a casual precision that belied the bomb she had just dropped into the center of his perfect, high-tech matrix. For the first time in their history, the cold billionaire CEO, a man whose mafia bloodline taught him that control was the only law, completely lost his composure. The silence that followed was deafening, a physical weight that pressed against the glass walls overlooking the glittering skyline. Cho Jung took a slow, deliberate step out of his office, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade through silk, yet carrying a raw edge she had never heard before. A date? He repeated, the words sounding foreign, as if it were a direct threat to his sovereignty. Tasha met his gaze with calm defiance, her spine straight and her heart hammering a rhythm of liberation. She was no longer just a shadow in his office. She was a woman 1 minute away from a life that didn't involve him. As the red numbers of the clock finally flipped to 8 p.m., The foundation of Cho Jung's world didn't just tremble, it shattered. The man who owned everything suddenly realized that the only asset he truly cared about was currently walking out the door. The heavy silence of the office was broken only by the rhythmic clicking of Tasha's heels as she moved toward the elevator, her mind already drifting to the quiet restaurant in Itaewon. But before the silver doors could slide open, the sharp, frantic chirp of her work phone shattered the moment. She didn't even have to look at the screen to know it was him. "Tasha, get back in here." Cho Jung's voice crackled through the line, stripped of its usual melodic coldness and replaced with an artificial urgency. The Tokyo merger just hit a wall. The legal team is claiming a breach of the non-compete clause. I need you to pull the 2024 compliance files immediately. Tasha froze, her hand hovering over the call button. She knew the Tokyo files inside and out. She had personally audited them 3 days ago to ensure the weekend would be clear. A breach was statistically impossible, but in the world of Cho Jung, his word was reality. Slowly, she turned back, her emerald dress shimmering under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway as she re-entered the suite. Cho Jung was standing by the window, his back to her, silhouetted against the skyline. He looked like a man under siege, his shoulders tense and his phone gripped like a weapon. "The lawyers are waiting on the conference line," he said without turning around, his tone a calculated mix of professional authority and hidden desperation. Tasha walked to her desk but didn't sit down. Instead, she opened her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys with a speed that had made her indispensable for 18 months. In less than 30 seconds, the compliance dashboard was live on her screen. There were no red flags, no urgent emails from Tokyo, and the conference line he mentioned was completely silent. She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing as she realized the depth of the sabotage. Cho Jung wasn't protecting his empire. He was hunting for a reason to keep her in his shadow. He was a man used to total control, the kind of mafia-bred billionaire who viewed his assistant's personal time as a flaw in his own sovereignty. "The Tokyo merger is fine, Cho Jung," she said, her voice steady and unimpressed. "In fact, I received a confirmation of the signing 10 minutes ago." He finally turned, his dark eyes searching hers for a hint of the Ice Queen compliance he was used to. For a second, the mask of the ruthless CEO slipped, revealing a raw, possessive hunger that had nothing to do with business. "I might have misread the update," he muttered, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low register. "Stay anyway. There are other things." "No," Tasha interrupted, snapping her laptop shut with a finality that echoed through the empty office. "My work is done. My time started at 8 p.m., and I intend to use it." She didn't wait for a rebuttal. She walked past him, the scent of her perfume clashing with the sterile office air, leaving Cho Jung standing alone in the darkening room. For the first time in his life, the boss didn't have the final word. The restaurant in Itaewon was a masterclass in atmospheric charm, filled with the low hum of jazz and the warm glow of amber candlelight. But for Tasha, the air felt suffocatingly thin. Across the small, intimate table, Joshua was speaking, something about a recent project or a mutual friend, but his voice seemed to originate from miles away. Tasha managed a practiced nod, her Ice Queen mask firmly in place, yet her mind remained trapped 47 stories above the city streets. Every time a waiter's shadow flickered against the wall, she saw the silhouette of Cho Jung standing by the floor-to-ceiling glass, his tie loosened and his eyes burning with a possessive heat. She could still feel the phantom weight of his gaze on her skin, a tether she had tried to snap at 8 p.m. that refused to let go. Back at the Han Corporation, the silence of the executive suite had been replaced by the sound of controlled destruction. Cho Jung moved through his office like a cyclone, the cold billionaire facade having completely disintegrated into a raw, mafia-bred fury. A stack of quarterly reports, the very ones Tasha had meticulously organized, was swept off his desk in a single, violent motion, the white pages fluttering to the floor like wounded birds. He didn't care about the Tokyo merger or the billion-dollar deals resting in those folders. The only thing that mattered was the ticking of the clock and the mental image of Tasha smiling at another man. He tore through a digital file on his monitor, his breath coming in sharp, jagged hitches, his hands trembling with an agitation he hadn't felt in a decade. In the restaurant, Tasha reached for her glass of wine, her fingers trembling just enough for the crystal to clink against the table. She looked at Joshua, who was kind and attentive, everything a normal date should be, and realized with a sinking heart that he was a ghost compared to the man she had left behind. Cho Jung's presence was everywhere, in the deep bass of the music that reminded her of his voice, and in the sharp cedarwood scent from a nearby table that mimicked his cologne. She was physically in Itaewon, but her soul was still anchored to the man currently tearing his empire apart in her absence. Cho Jung slammed his fist onto the mahogany surface of his desk, the sound echoing through the empty halls of the 38th floor. He was a man who owned half of Seoul, yet he felt utterly bankrupt. He had tried to sabotage her evening with a fake crisis, but her defiance had only stoked the fire. Every file he threw, every chair he shoved, was a futile attempt to drown out the one truth he could no longer ignore. Tasha was the only person who could truly break him. As the night deepened, the distance between the office and the restaurant felt like an open wound, bleeding with the realization that their 18 months of professional silence had reached a violent, inevitable end. The cool night air of Itaewon did little to soothe the restlessness buzzing in Tasha's veins. Her date with Joshua had ended in a polite, hollow handshake. He was a good man, but he lacked the gravitational pull that had anchored her to the 38th floor for the last 18 months. It was only when she reached into her clutch to call a car that she realized the weight of her mistake. Her magnetic keycard and apartment keys were still sitting in the top drawer of her mahogany desk. The Han Corporation building stood like a silent obsidian monolith against the skyline, its windows dark except for the faint, ghostly glow of the executive levels. Tasha's heels echoed through the empty lobby with a sharp, lonely rhythm that mirrored her heartbeat. As the elevator ascended, she smoothed the emerald fabric of her dress, her ice queen, mask slipping back into place, yet her breath hitched as the doors slid open to the 38th floor. The office was a graveyard of order. The amber spotlights were gone, replaced by the cold, oppressive blue of the moonlight filtering through the glass walls. Tasha stopped in her tracks, her eyes widening as she took in the carnage of the room. Quarterly reports were scattered across the floor like fallen snow, and a heavy chair had been shoved aside with violent force. In the center of the wreckage sat Cho Jung, his silhouette framed by the glittering city lights. He wasn't behind his desk, he was perched on the edge of it, his legs apart and his head bowed. His jacket was discarded, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the tensed muscles of his forearms, and his tie hung loosely around his neck like a noose. This wasn't the billionaire CEO the public feared. This was the mafia boss, the man who lived in the shadows and governed through raw, unfiltered power. "You came back," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated in the hollow of Tasha's throat. He didn't look up, but she felt his presence expand to fill every inch of the darkened room. "I forgot my keys," Tasha managed, her voice steadier than she felt. She moved toward her desk, her eyes fixed on the drawer, but she could feel him watching her every movement with a predatory focus. Cho Jung stood up slowly, his movements fluid and dangerous. The cold billionaire was gone, replaced by a man who had finally snapped under the weight of his own repressed obsession. He stepped into the moonlight, the blue light catching the sharp angles of his face and the desperate, possessive glint in his eyes. 18 months, Tasha," he whispered, closing the distance between them until she was backed against the cold glass of the window. 18 months of being perfect. And you thought you could just walk out at 8 p.m. and leave me in the dark. The air between them was electric, charged with the sudden collapse of 1,000 professional boundaries. The midnight return hadn't just brought Tasha back for her keys. It had brought her face to face with the man behind the mask, and for the first time, the Ice Queen had no idea how to melt the frost. The silence of the 47th floor was no longer professional. It was suffocating, heavy with the scent of rain and the sharp tang of Cho Jung's desperation. He stood so close that Tasha could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cold glass pressing against her back. The cold billionaire mask hadn't just cracked. It had disintegrated, leaving behind a man who looked like he was witnessing his empire crumble in real time. I couldn't breathe, Cho Jung rasped, his voice trembling with a raw vulnerability that terrified her more than his anger ever had. He slammed a hand against the glass beside her head, his eyes searching hers with a frantic, possessive hunger. From the moment you said you had a date, I couldn't think. I couldn't function. I've spent 18 months trying to convince myself that you were just an asset, a perfect, efficient tool for my business. But I was lying to myself every single day. Tasha watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the way his fingers shook, the way his usually perfect hair was disheveled, and the way the mafia boss had been reduced to a man begging for a glance. The obsession he had buried under billion-dollar deals and icy commands was finally out in the light, jagged and dangerous. "You think this is love?" Tasha asked, her voice low but cutting through his spiral with the precision of a scalpel. She didn't flinch as he leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. "You've kept me here until midnight for weeks. You've sabotaged my personal life and monitored my every move under the guise of professional necessity. This isn't a confession, Cho Jung. It's a cage." He flinched as if she had struck him, his hand dropping from the glass. "Tasha, I was trying to protect you. In my world, people like you are targets. If I keep you close." "You don't want an assistant. You want a cage," she interrupted, her emerald dress shimmering as she stepped out from between him and the window, finally reclaiming her space. She turned to face him, her eyes bright with 18 months of repressed truth. "You want someone you can control, someone who has no life outside of these four walls because it makes you feel safe. But I am a woman, not a possession. And if you can't see the difference, then 18 months was 18 months too long." The office fell back into a deafening silence. Cho Jung stood in the moonlight, looking at his empty hands as the weight of her words settled over him. The mask was gone, but in its place was a mirror, and for the first time in his life, the boss didn't like what he saw reflecting back. The moon shifted, casting long, jagged shadows across the wreckage of the office as Cho Jung remained frozen, a man stripped of his armor in the presence of the woman he had tried to possess. Tasha watched him, her emerald dress catching the cold light as she stood among the scattered files, no longer a subordinate waiting for an order, but a force of nature demanding a reckoning. The mafia boss had been silenced by the simple truth of his own cowardice, and the air between them vibrated with the weight of things left unsaid for 18 months. "I'm not a target to be protected, and I'm certainly not an asset to be managed," Tasha said, her voice steady and echoing through the hollow glass cathedral of the 38th floor. She walked to her desk, not to retrieve her keys, but to lean against it, crossing her arms as she stared down the man who held half of soul in his palm. "You've spent over a year using your power to keep me in your shadow because you were afraid of what would happen if I stood beside you instead of behind you." Cho Jung finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and raw, the desperate hunger still flickering in the dark depths of his gaze. "I don't know how to do this, Tasha," he confessed, his voice a jagged rasp. "In my family, equality is a fairy tale. You either rule or you are ruled." "Then you'd better learn quickly," Tasha countered, her tone sharpening into an ultimatum that cut through his self-pity. "Because here are my terms. I will not be your perfect assistant anymore. I will not be the ghost who cleans up your messes while you pretend I don't exist outside of working hours." She took a step toward him, her shadow merging with his on the debris-strewn floor. "If I stay at Han Corporation, it is as your equal, professionally and personally. No more midnight emergencies to keep me from my life. No more sabotaging my dates because you can't control your temper. You acknowledge my mind, my authority, and my right to walk out that door whenever I choose." Cho Jung's breath hitched, his hands slowly unclenching as he absorbed the gravity of her words. The power dynamic that had governed their lives for 500 days was dissolving in real time, replaced by a terrifying, egalitarian void. And if I can't? He whispered, the question hanging in the air like a death sentence. Then I walk, Tasha said, her voice devoid of hesitation. I'll leave this office tonight, and you will never see me again. You can find another assistant to fill your files, but you will never find another woman who sees the man behind the monster and is still brave enough to stay. The choice was laid bare in the moonlight, his pride or her presence. For the first time in his life, the boss had no leverage, and for the first time in hers, Tasha had all the power. The fragile silence that followed Tasha's ultimatum was shattered not by Cho Jung's answer, but by the frantic, synchronized vibration of 3 different phones on his mahogany desk. The blue moonlight in the office was suddenly drowned out by the harsh, rhythmic flashing of emergency alerts on every monitor in the room. For a heartbeat, Cho Jung's mafia boss instincts flared. He lunged for his primary device, his face hardening as he read the decrypted text. It's the Kong Syndicate, he rasped, the vulnerability of the previous moment replaced by a cold, lethal focus. They've launched a coordinated short sell on our stock, while simultaneously hacking our logistics servers in Busan. They aren't just trying to hurt the company. They're moving for a hostile takeover before the markets open in London. He grabbed his jacket, already moving toward the door to call his security detail, but Tasha didn't move. She didn't flinch at the mention of his rivals or the dark underworld that was currently clawing at the gates of Han Corporation. Instead, she stepped over the scattered files on the floor and sat down at her desk, her fingers already dancing across her keyboard with a calm, terrifying precision. Stop, she commanded, and the sheer authority in her voice made the billionaire freeze in his tracks. If you call your enforcers, you play right into their hands. They want a visible conflict to spook the shareholders and tank the stock further. You don't need a gun right now, Cho Jung. You need a ghost. Cho Jung watched, mesmerized, as Tasha bypassed the primary servers and accessed a hidden sublayer of the company's digital architecture, a failsafe she had secretly built months ago. While the Kong Syndicate's hackers were busy attacking the front door, Tasha was silently rerouting the company's liquidity through a series of offshore shell accounts she had mapped out during her 18 months of silence. I'm triggering a poison pill defense, she explained, her eyes fixed on the scrolling green code on her monitor. I'm flooding the market with temporarily restricted stock units that only our internal partners can verify. Their short sell is going to collapse in exactly 90 seconds, and the price will rebound so fast it'll bankrupt their front companies. The room was silent except for the frantic clicking of her keys. Cho Jung stood over her shoulder, watching as his assistant, the woman he had tried to keep in a cage, systematically dismantled a mafia-backed corporate execution with nothing but her intellect. He saw the raw brilliance he had tried to suppress, the strategic mind that was faster and more ruthless than his own. Done, she whispered, leaning back as the monitors flushed blue, indicating the threat had been neutralized. The hostile takeover had been averted before it even made the morning news. She looked up at him, her gaze level and unyielding. That was for the company. Now, do we have a deal, or do I leave? Cho Jung looked at the screen, then at the woman who had just saved his legacy. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just been trying to cage a beautiful woman. He had been trying to cage a queen. The morning sun crawled over the glass spires of Seoul, but inside the Han Corporation's grand boardroom, the air remained frozen in a state of predatory anticipation. The Old Guard, a collection of gray-haired directors and silent representatives of the mafia underworld, sat around the massive obsidian table, their murmurs like the hissing of vipers. They had heard rumors of the near disaster the night before and were ready to feast on Cho Jung's perceived weakness. The double doors swung open with a heavy thud, and Cho Jung stepped into the room. He was impeccable, his black suit tailored to a lethal edge, but he didn't head for the head of the table immediately. Instead, he stood aside, holding the door with a gesture of deference that caused a visible ripple of shock to pass through the directors. Tasha walked in, her head held high, wearing a sharp power suit that commanded the room's gravity. She didn't carry a notepad or a coffee tray. She carried a tablet, and the unshakable aura of a woman who had already won the war. "Who is this?" one of the elder directors barked, his eyes narrowing at Tasha. "We are here to discuss the security breach and the Kong Syndicate's move. We have no time for administrative staff." Cho Jung didn't raise his voice, but the cold, dangerous timbre of it silenced the room instantly. "You are mistaken," he said, stepping toward the table, his eyes scanning the critics with a gaze that reminded them exactly why he was feared. "You aren't looking at an assistant. You are looking at the person who single-handedly neutralized a coordinated cyber assault and a hostile takeover while the rest of you were asleep in your beds." He placed a hand on the back of the chair to his right, the seat usually reserved for the most senior advisor, and pulled it out for her. "While the Kong Syndicate tried to bleed us dry, she triggered a poison pill defense and rerouted our liquidity before a single one was lost. Without her brilliance, this corporation would be a hollow shell by noon today." Tasha sat, the silence in the room now heavy with a different kind of weight, respect born of fear. She opened the data on the screen, her voice calm and authoritative as she began to outline the new security protocols she had designed overnight. Cho Jung watched her, not as a master watching a servant, but as a man witnessing the birth of an equal. He saw the board members who had once dismissed her now leaning forward, hanging on her every word. He had spent 18 months trying to hide her light in the shadows of his office, but as she dismantled the director's doubts with surgical precision, he realized that standing in her glow was the only place he ever wanted to be. The Ice Queen had taken the throne, and the Mafia boss was finally content to let her lead. The heavy, mahogany doors of the boardroom finally clicked shut, leaving the echoing silence of the executive suite to settle around them like a shroud. Tasha stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the city below. The same skyline that had witnessed her silent labor for 18 months now looked different, less like a prison and more like a kingdom she had finally claimed. Behind her, the soft rustle of paper was the only sound in the room. Cho Jung didn't approach her with his usual predatory stride. Instead, he moved with a newfound hesitancy, stopping a respectful distance away. On the table lay a single, thick document bound in black leather. "It's already signed," he said, his voice dropping into that low, velvet register that had always made Tasha's pulse skip, though now it lacked the cold edge of command. Tasha turned, her emerald suit catching the afternoon light. She walked to the table and flipped open the cover. At the top, in bold, uncompromising letters, were the words, "Appointment of Vice President of Strategic Operations." Below that, her name sat beside a salary and a benefit package that would make the directors she had just silenced weep with envy. But it was the clause at the very bottom, handwritten in Cho Jung's sharp, precise script, that stopped her breath. Reporting to no one. Accountability. The board and the CEO are equal partners. "This is the professional side of our deal," Cho Jung murmured, finally stepping closer, though he kept his hands clasped behind his back, honoring the space she had demanded. "You saved the firm. You proved your mind is the greatest asset this empire has. But the VP title is just a piece of paper if I don't change, too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, translucent digital timer, the red numbers frozen at 90:00. He placed it on top of the contract. 90 days, he promised, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a raw sincerity that made the Mafia boss look like a man reborn. 3 months where I don't call you after hours. 3 months where I don't ask about your dates. 3 months where I earn the right to stand beside you, not as your boss, but as your man. Tasha looked from the contract to the timer, then back to the man who had spent 1.5 years trying to cage her. For the first time, she didn't see a captor or a cold billionaire. She saw a man willing to dismantle his own ego to keep her in his world. 90 days, Cho Jung, she whispered, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. Starting now. She picked up a pen and signed her name with a flourish. As she turned to walk out of the office, this time, with the keys to the city firmly in her hand, she heard the soft click of the timer starting its countdown. The power shift was complete. The digital numbers on the timer on Tasha's new desk hummed softly, a rhythmic pulse of light that marked the passing of the first hour of their new reality. The 38th floor was no longer a labyrinth of secrets and suppressed longing. It had been recalibrated into a space of mutual respect. Tasha stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, her reflection no longer that of the invisible shadow behind the throne, but the woman who had claimed her seat upon it. The skyline stretched out before her, a sprawling tapestry of neon and steel that seemed to acknowledge her ascent. The soft click of a door announced Cho Jung's arrival. In the past, his entrance would have signaled a list of demands or a cold critique of her schedule. Now, he stopped at the threshold of her office, waiting for her silent permission to enter. He walked to the window, maintaining the respectful distance they had agreed upon, his hands tucked into his pockets as he joined her in surveying the city. The cold billionaire was still there, visible in the sharp line of his jaw and the expensive cut of his suit, but the predatory edge had been tempered by a profound, visible humility. The board approved the new security protocols without a single objection, Cho Jung said, his voice a low, steady rumble. They're afraid of you, Tasha. And for the first time, I'm not the one they're looking to for mercy. Tasha didn't turn away from the view, but a faint, knowing smile touched her lips. They should be afraid. I know where every ghost in this company is buried, including yours. Cho Jung let out a short, dry laugh, a sound of genuine amusement that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He looked at her, and for a moment, the countdown between them felt like an eternity and a heartbeat all at once. The 90 days were a bridge they were building together, stone by stone, moving away from the toxicity of the cage and toward the solid ground of a partnership. I used to think I owned this city, Cho Jung admitted, his gaze drifting back to the glittering lights of Itaewon and the dark flow of the Han River. But looking at it now, with you standing here, I realize I was just guarding a hollow fortress. You didn't just save the firm, Tasha. You saved me from becoming the monster my family expected me to be. Tasha finally turned to him, the moonlight catching the emerald of her dress and the fire in her eyes. She reached out, not to touch him, but to tap the timer on her desk, the red numbers ticking down with relentless precision. 90 days to prove you can handle a woman who doesn't need you to survive, Cho Jung. A woman who is your match in every way that matters. Cho Jung inclined his head, a gesture of absolute surrender to the new era they had inaugurated. I've spent my life winning battles I didn't care about. This is the only one I'm truly afraid to lose. Together, they turned back to the window, two titans looking out over a city that was finally theirs to share. The boss had finally met his match, and as the night deepened over Seoul, the countdown continued. A promise of a future where they would no longer be master and servant, but the most dangerous and devoted pair the city had ever seen. Please like and subscribe, and don't stop here. Check out our channel for more interesting stories.